What you are about to read is a compiled documentary record. It is not fiction. It is not propaganda. It is not an embellishment written to make any one species feel superior or diminished. It is, to the best of our collective ability, the truth. The testimonies gathered within this file come from 37 separate witnesses. They span 7 different species. They were collected across a period of 11 galactic standard years following the incident now referred to formally as the Kael'drath Summit confrontation, and informally in taverns and mess halls and cargo bays across 600 inhabited systems as simply the Hammer. We have done our best to arrange these testimonies in chronological order. We have preserved the voices of the speakers rather than sanitizing them into clean, institutional prose, because we felt, unanimously, that clean institutional prose would be an insult to what happened that day. Some of the witnesses are decorated military officers. Some are cargo handlers. Some are children who are now adults with children of their own. One of them, Witness 17, refused to give us her name and communicated entirely through her species' olfactory language, which our translators have rendered as best they can into written standard. We have tried to be faithful to all of them. What follows is their story. It is also, in many ways, humanity's story. And it begins, as so many important things do, with someone being dismissed. Part 1, The World Before It Happened. Witness 1, Senior Trade Attaché Melvana Sor, Hegemony Diplomatic Corps. Recorded 14 months post-incident. Location, Hegemony Embassy Station, Outer Ring Corridor 7. I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I've been doing this job for 42 years. 42 years of diplomatic summits, trade negotiations, border disputes, territorial agreements, species introductions, cultural exchange programs, and every variety of political theater you can imagine. I have sat in rooms with beings whose nervous systems operate on electromagnetic pulses rather than chemical signals. I have negotiated with a species that communicates exclusively through the deliberate arrangement of rocks. I have attended a 3-day-long ceremony where the central act was the collaborative digestion of a ceremonial mineral, and I did it with a straight face. I am not easily surprised. So understand what I'm telling you when I say that what happened on Kael'drath Station on the 14th day of the Convergence Summit was the single most surprising thing I have witnessed in 4 decades of interspecies work. The summit itself, I should give you the background because context matters here. The summit had been building for about 6 standard months. The Hegemony was trying to negotiate what they were calling the Unification Compact, which was essentially a very polite way of saying they wanted every independent or semi-independent species within their territorial sphere to formally acknowledge hegemony supremacy. Not just trade relationships, not just defensive alliances. Full acknowledgement of the hegemony as the central governing authority of this arm of the galaxy. For most species, this was complicated but manageable. The Vethori had been aligned with the hegemony for 2 centuries anyway. The Drassic Confederation had economic ties so deep that refusal was essentially impossible. The Morn Collective was already operating under a junior protectorate arrangement and had been for generations. But humanity was different. Humanity had only been part of the broader galactic community for about 60 years at that point. 60 years is nothing. In galactic terms, that's the equivalent of a species that learned to read last Tuesday and is now being invited to a conference to discuss the future of civilization. Most species spend millennia going through the gradual integration process. First contact, observation period, limited trade, formal introduction, cultural exchange, and then eventually political negotiation. Humans did it in 60 years. And they didn't do it carefully or diplomatically, or with the measured pace that most established species appreciate. They did it the way humans seem to do everything, with a kind of chaotic, relentless energy that the hegemony found either fascinating or deeply concerning, depending on which department you were talking to. The thing that complicated the summit was that humanity had sent, and I say this with genuine respect for the choice, because in retrospect I think it was either genius or madness and possibly both. They had sent a delegation that was not their most experienced diplomats. Their senior diplomatic staff was caught up in a separate territorial dispute with the Kreth Collective on the other side of the arm. What they sent to Kael'drath was a secondary delegation, junior staff, clerks. A couple of mid-level policy advisors who'd been with the diplomatic corps for less than a decade. And a boy. His name was Emmett Voss. He was 16 years old. He was the son of Admiral Petra Voss, who was currently commanding the human defensive fleet near the Kreth border and had absolutely no ability to attend a summit 6 systems away. Emmett was there because, and I'm going to quote from the official dispatch, because nothing I could say would capture it better. Familial accompaniment was approved as a cultural accommodation following the human delegation's request for a minor representative in observational capacity, in accordance with hegemony youth inclusion protocols. Which is a very formal way of saying, they let a kid come along because his mother asked, and the hegemony has a rule about not excluding young members of delegations, because about 800 years ago there was a catastrophic diplomatic incident involving the exclusion of a Vethori elder child, and nobody ever wanted to repeat that. I noticed Emmett the first day, hard not to. He was the only being in the entire summit complex under the age of 30, by any species reckoning. He was average height for a human adolescent, which means he was shorter than most of the adult delegates from most species. He had dark hair that he didn't seem to have put a great deal of effort into that morning, or possibly any morning. He wore the standard-issue human diplomatic observer badge, the kind that's laminated and clips to your collar, and he kept fidgeting with it. He watched everything with this expression. I've thought about how to describe it many times since. It was like the expression of someone who has decided that the best strategy in an unfamiliar situation is to memorize every single detail of it. Not nervous, exactly. Not intimidated. Just cataloging. Taking everything in. I thought, here is a human child who is being very brave in a place that was not designed for him. I had no idea what he was going to do 14 days later. Witness 2, Cargo Master Drevek Thul, Independent Freight Carrier Steadfast Burden. Recorded 8 months post-incident. Location, Keldreth Station, Commercial Dock, Bay 19. Yeah, I was there. I was docked at Keldreth for about 3 weeks around the summit period. We had a delayed cargo delivery, mechanical issue with the secondary drive coil, nothing exciting. So I was stuck there while all this diplomatic stuff was happening around me. I'll be honest with you, I'm not political. I don't care about the hegemony's unification compact or whatever they were calling it. I care about delivery windows and fuel costs and whether my crew is going to get paid on time. That's my world. But Keldreth Station during a summit, that's not a small thing, even for someone who doesn't care about politics. The place was enormous on a regular day. During the summit, it was something else entirely. Keldreth Station, for people who have never been, is one of the oldest permanent stations in this arm. It was built by the hegemony about 1,200 years ago as a neutral meeting ground. The central hub is about 30 kilometers across. The outer ring has docking capacity for maybe 4,000 vessels at any given time. The summit halls in the center are these huge cathedral spaces with ceilings that go up maybe 200 meters, which matters when you've got species that stand 8 meters tall trying to negotiate with species that stand 1 meter tall. The design is meant to accommodate everyone. The Hall of Records, where the formal ceremonies happened, had a floor that could hold maybe 20,000 beings. And during the climax of the summit, the presentation of witnesses, which was the formal ceremony where each species delegation would present their statement of intention regarding the compact, it was packed. Standing room only. Delegates, observers, journalists from about 40 systems, ceremonial guards from every species that had a military presence at the summit. The hegemony had their guards, obviously. The Drassic had sent a security detachment. The Vethori had ceremonial escort units. And then there was the Karath Dominion. That's look, if you want to understand what happened with the hammer, you need to understand the Karath. The Karath Dominion is the hegemony's oldest military ally. They've been fighting together for about 2,000 years. The Karath are, there's no delicate way to say this, they're big. Physically. The average adult Karath stands about 3.5 meters tall, and they're built in proportion to that. Dense muscle structure, skeletal system reinforced with a biological mineral compound that makes their bones roughly equivalent to industrial-grade steel alloy, 4 arms, and a central nervous system that processes physical stimulus about 4 times faster than most species. In their culture, and this is important, physical strength is not just a practical asset. It's a moral indicator. It's genuinely part of their belief system that the degree of a being's strength correlates to the degree of their spiritual worth. They're not stupid about it. They know intellectually that other species have different physiologies, but emotionally, culturally, the instinct to assess worth through physical capacity is deep. It's not something you reason away in a conversation. It's woven into everything they do. Their emperor at the time, Emperor Valdros VII, or as most people just said, Valdros, he was at the summit personally, which was already unusual. Karath emperors don't typically attend diplomatic summits. They send representatives. The fact that Valdros showed up in person told you something about how seriously the Karath were taking the compact. He was impressive. I'll give him that. Even if everything that followed made me see him very differently in that moment, walking into the Hall of Records, Valdros was genuinely impressive. He stood nearly 4.5 meters. He was old, maybe 300 years by Karath reckoning, and he had this quality that old powerful beings sometimes have, where they've been so strong for so long that their stillness becomes more intimidating than movement. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. His presence did the work for him. He had 6 ceremonial guards flanking him, and behind the guards, I still can't quite describe how to characterize it. On a ceremonial carrying platform borne by 12 additional guards, they had brought the hammer. Witness 3, Junior Communications Officer Talon Mace, Human Diplomatic Corps. Recorded 6 months post-incident. Location, Human Embassy, Keldrath Station, Residential Block. Okay, so I want to start with the hammer because that thing is at the center of all of this, and I don't think most people actually understand what it is, what it represents, why it matters. The Karath wore hammer, the specific one that was at the summit, the one that people now just call the hammer, capital H, it's called the Shathkral, which translates roughly to the judgment of weight. It's a ceremonial weapon, but calling it ceremonial doesn't really capture it. It's more like it's a sacred object, a religious object. It's also a functioning weapon. Both things are true simultaneously for the Karath. The Shathkral has been in the Karath Dominion for about 1,400 years. It was forged, and this is the part that people found hard to believe before they measured it. It was forged from a compressed stellar alloy that the Karath extracted from a collapsed stellar remnant. The process took about 2 centuries. The object itself is roughly 3 meters long, with a head that's about 1 meter by 1 meter, and it weighs, at standard gravity, approximately 480 tons. We estimated. We weren't sure of the exact figure until after the incident when some people from the science division went and actually measured it. The number they gave was 476 tons. The Shathkral is the central object in the Karath's presentation of strength ceremony, which they perform at the beginning of any formal alliance-making. The tradition is that the emperor or his designated champion lifts the hammer, not swings it, not wields it, just lifts it, gets it off the ground, holds it for as long as possible. The duration of the lift is recorded as a formal part of the treaty record. It's the Karath's way of saying, we are what we are, we have the strength we claim to have, and this alliance rests on that foundation. Valdros could lift it. Valdros could hold it for about 45 seconds, which was exceptional even by Karath standards. The problem, and this is where the diplomatic situation got complicated, is that the Karath had inserted language into the compact that essentially said every species joining the alliance needed to participate in the presentation of strength ceremony, or at least acknowledge the Shathkral as a symbol of their commitment to the alliance's strength. Most species took this in the spirit it was intended, as a cultural tradition to be respected, not a literal physical challenge. But Emperor Valdros had, somewhere in the weeks leading up to the summit, decided to make it something more than that. I don't know if it was political strategy or genuine cultural disdain, probably both, but he'd started making comments, public comments, to other delegations about humanity specifically. The gist of the comments was, humans are a child species. They've been in the community for 60 years. They have enthusiasm, perhaps, but they lack depth, maturity, and this word kept coming up in the translated comments, weight, not physical weight. Existential weight. The Karath concept of earned gravity, of being a species that has proven itself over centuries. And then, in one pre-summit reception that about half the delegations attended, Valdros looked directly at our delegation, our junior, somewhat chaotic, notably young delegation, and he said something that got translated as, "Sending children to a gathering of empires is either a profound insult or a confession of inadequacy. With humans, I find it difficult to determine which." He was looking at Emmett when he said it. Emmett, who was standing near the back of our group, holding a glass of something he'd been told was a non-alcoholic refreshment, wearing his laminated observer badge. Emmett didn't react visibly. He just looked back at Valdros with that cataloging expression, taking everything in. But our senior attaché at the time, ambassador assistant Farron Halst, he told me later that night that he'd gone over to check on Emmett after the reception, and Emmett had said only one thing. He'd said, "How heavy is the hammer?" Witness 4, Imperial Protocol Officer Thessavaru, Karath Dominion. Recorded 22 months post-incident. Location, classified. Note, this testimony was obtained through a third-party intermediary and translated from High Karath. The witness requested anonymity from the Karath government, but agreed to inclusion in this record. We have honored both requests. I am going to say something that is difficult for a Karath official to say, and I'm going to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity. Emperor Valdros made a mistake. Not in his assessment of humanity's political immaturity. That assessment was in some respects accurate. 60 years of galactic participation is genuinely limited. The human delegation at Kael'drath was genuinely inexperienced. These are facts. The mistake was in his certainty. In Karath culture, there is a distinction between strength that has been measured and strength that has been demonstrated. Measured strength is what you can calculate, what instruments can tell you, what training records can show, what biological parameters suggest. Demonstrated strength is what happens in the moment, in the weight of actual circumstance. Emperor Valdros was experienced with measured strength. He had ruled for 230 years. He had seen thousands of beings attempt and fail the Shathcrawl. He knew, with what he believed was certainty, what a being of human dimensions and human biology was physiologically capable of lifting. He was, by every conventional metric, correct. Humans of average adult dimensions and mass should not have been able to lift the Shathcrawl. The weight-to-muscle ratio analysis that our science division performed prior to the summit was thorough. The conclusion was unambiguous. No human being of any age should have been capable of lifting that hammer. What the analysis failed to account for, what all of our analysis failed to account for, and I say this as someone who reviewed those reports personally, was the variable that our instruments don't measure. The variable of why. I have spent the years since the summit thinking about this, and the conclusion I keep returning to is this. The Shathcrawl does not only measure strength, it was designed to measure strength. But strength, it turns out, is not only a biological phenomenon. I wish we had understood this before the 14th day. Part 2, the 14 days. Witness 5, Emmett Voss. Recorded 3 years post-incident. Location, human settlement, Kael'drath Station. Emmett was 19 years old at the time of this recording. I want to be upfront about something. I've told this story a lot of times. Too many times, probably. It's gotten to the point where I can feel myself performing parts of it instead of just remembering them, and I don't want to do that here. So I'm going to try to tell you what I actually remember, not the polished version, the actual one. First thing I actually remember about Kael'drath Station is the smell. Which sounds weird, but I'd never been on a multi-species station that large before. The air recycling systems on big mixed-species stations have to accommodate the atmospheric preferences of maybe 30 or 40 different respiratory biologies, and the result is this: I don't know how to describe it. It's not bad, exactly. It's just dense. Like the air has too much information in it. I remember stepping off the transport and just standing there for a second processing it. The second thing I remember is how big everything was, and I don't mean the station itself, although the station was obviously enormous. I mean the scale of the beings in it. The Karath, obviously, they were the most dramatic. But even species that weren't as large as the Karath, the Vethori, the Drassic, everything was calibrated to a size that made me feel like I was 10 years old again and visiting my grandmother's house, where all the furniture was adult-sized, and I kept miscalculating reach and distance. I was the youngest person there by a significant margin. I knew that going in, Ambassador Halst had briefed me very thoroughly on the composition of the summit, but knowing it intellectually is different from being in it. There were moments in those first few days where I just felt very, very small. Not afraid exactly, just aware of the gap between where I was and where most of the beings around me were. I started keeping notes. I'd brought 2 physical notebooks, paper, not digital because paper can't be hacked or remotely accessed, and I started filling them pretty much immediately. Not formal diplomatic notes, just observations, things I noticed. The way the Karath guards stood. The way the Vethori delegates always positioned themselves near the ventilation sources. The way the Drassic had a habit of tapping their secondary manipulator limbs when they were processing information. This rapid staccato pattern like fingers drumming on a table. I noticed the hammer on the second day. They'd brought it into the Hall of Records and positioned it on its ceremonial platform in the center of the room. Just displayed it there for the duration of the summit, like a centerpiece, or maybe more like a statement. I stood in front of it for a while. The guards, Karath ceremonial guards, massive in their formal armor, watched me with what I can only describe as amused contempt. I was clearly not a threat. I was a human adolescent staring at their sacred weapon with wide eyes. I wrote in my notebook, Shathkral, stellar alloy, approx. 500 tons, actually closer to 480, check the science reports. Head is about 1 cubic meter. Handle looks like a single cast piece, no visible seam, surface is dark, almost no reflectivity. Feels it's hard to explain, it has a presence, not supernatural, just a lot of physical mass concentrated in one place. That has a gravitational effect that you can actually feel if you're close enough. Then I wrote, the Emperor looked at me like I was furniture. Then I sat with that for a while. I want to be honest about what happened over those 14 days, because I think people have built a story around it where I was being strategic, where I had a plan, where everything was deliberate. It wasn't quite like that. What actually happened was, I was bored. Not dismissively bored, I was interested in everything. But I wasn't a delegate. I wasn't in the negotiating rooms. I was an observer with a badge that said observer on it, and my job, such as it was to watch and take notes and stay out of the way. So I had a lot of free time, and I started spending a lot of that free time near the Hall of Records. And near the hammer. On the 4th day, one of the junior Karath guards, he was junior, which meant he was only about 3 meters tall instead of 3.5. He came over to where I was sitting on the floor making sketches of the hammer's head, and said something in Karath that the translator rendered as, "The child draws the Shathkral. Does the child think he can lift it?" And it wasn't even said meanly, really. It was said the way you might say to a toddler who is studying a car engine, "Does the baby think he can drive?" I said, "I don't know. Can you tell me more about how the metal was formed?" He blinked at me. I think he was surprised I'd engaged at all. We talked for about 2 hours. His name was Vithrak. He was young by Karath standards, maybe 60 years old. He'd never actually had a real conversation with a human before. He was curious about us, underneath the cultural programming that said we were negligible. He told me everything he knew about the Shathkral, the forging process, the ceremonial history, the physics of the lift as the Karath understood it, the record holders, the failures. I filled 3 pages of my notebook. On the 6th day, very early in the morning when the Hall of Records was mostly empty, I walked up to the hammer and put my hand on it. Just to see what it felt like. It was cold, colder than I expected, and it had a texture that wasn't smooth and wasn't rough, something in between, like something that had been worked so many times it had settled into itself. The mass of it was, you could feel it through your hand. Not the weight, obviously, I wasn't lifting it. But there's a quality to very dense, very massive objects when you touch them that communicates itself. Like the object has so much presence that it bleeds a little into the space around it. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes with my hand on it. I didn't think I'm going to lift this. That thought hadn't occurred to me yet. I thought, I wonder what it would take. Witness 6, Ambassador Assistant Farron Halst, Human Diplomatic Corps. Recorded 9 months post-incident. Location, Human Diplomatic Corps Headquarters, Earth. I need to tell you about the Valdros statement on the 8th day, because that's the one that changed everything. We'd been managing a very delicate situation for the first week of the summit. The compact negotiations were proceeding slowly, as these things do, but there was an undercurrent that was making our entire delegation uncomfortable. The Karath contingent, taking their cues from Valdros, had been consistently treating our delegation as a kind of, I want to be diplomatic about this, but there's really only one word, as a kind of joke, not in official proceedings. In official proceedings, Valdros was formal and correct. But in the corridors, in the reception spaces, in the informal interactions that make up maybe 60% of any summit, The treatment was dismissive. And it was escalating. On the 8th day, during one of the open-floor sessions where any delegation could make a statement to the assembled gathering, Valdros stood up. He spoke for about 12 minutes. The official subject was the terms of the compact's security provisions, but the actual content, the thing that landed, was a lengthy philosophical argument for why some species should be considered foundation members of the new compact and others should be considered provisional members. Foundation members would have full voting rights and full access to shared resources. Provisional members would participate at a reduced level until they demonstrated sufficient, and he used a very specific Karath word, which translated as specific gravity, sufficient specific gravity to be elevated. He listed 3 species as examples of provisional members. Humanity was the first one he named. The rationale he gave was exactly what he'd been implying in private for 2 weeks. Humans were too new, too untested. The 60 years of galactic participation was insufficient to demonstrate the kind of deep, earned weight that Foundation membership required. And then, and this is the part that got very quiet in that room, he gestured toward the center of the hall, toward the Shathcrawl, and he said, "The judgment of weight does not lie. Every species in this room knows what the Shathcrawl is. Every species in this room knows what it demands. I invite the human delegation to consider whether they are ready to stand before it." He wasn't literally proposing that a human attempt the lift. It was a rhetorical gesture, a way of saying, you cannot meet the standards we set. But the room went very quiet, because in that room, at that moment, standing about 6 meters behind our official delegation, was a 16-year-old boy in a blue observer's badge who had been spending his free time sitting next to that hammer for 8 days. I looked at Emmett. Emmett was looking at Valdros, and then Emmett wrote something in his notebook. I couldn't see what it was from where I stood. I didn't find out until later. When I did find out what he'd written was Day 8, he said it out loud. Just that, Day 8, he said it out loud. Witness 7, Dr. Renak Holst, Human Medical Division, Summit Delegation. Recorded 7 months post-incident. Location, Medical Bay, Human Embassy Station. I'm a doctor. I think in physiological terms. So I'm going to give you the physiological context because I don't think it gets talked about enough in the other accounts I've heard. Human adolescents at 16 are biologically not at peak physical capacity. We're past the initial growth phase, the skeletal system is mostly complete, muscle tissue is still developing toward its adult density. We're not fragile, but we're not at the apex of human physical capability either. Additionally, and this is the part that matters when you're talking about 476 tons, human beings, regardless of age, are not built to lift that weight. No human is. Adult male humans at peak physical conditioning can, under extraordinary circumstances, generate a maximum deadlift force of somewhere between 2 and 2.5 times their body weight. Even if you doubled that, tripled it, put a human through some experimental enhancement program, 476 tons is not a number that falls within the range of human physiological capability. I knew this, every scientist at the summit knew this. So when I noticed, on the 10th day, that Emmett Voss was no longer spending his time sitting near the hammer, but instead was getting up very early and running laps of the outer corridor, which is about 3 kilometers to a loop, I watched him with a clinical eye. He ran about 12 laps before the station's morning cycle began. He did this for 3 days. He was also, I noticed, eating significantly more than usual. Dense proteins, complex carbohydrates, concentrated nutrition. Not abnormally, nothing that would have triggered any kind of medical flag. But I was watching. On the 12th day, I asked him, very casually, how he was feeling. He said, fine, actually really good. Weird amount of energy. I said, are you planning something? He thought about it for a moment and then said, I'm thinking about it. I said, Emmett, listen to me. Whatever you're considering, I need you to understand the numbers. There is no physical training you can do in 14 days that would meaningfully change what your body is capable of lifting. The Shathcrawl weighs approximately 500 tons. Human beings cannot. He interrupted me. Gently, not rudely, he just sort of stopped me. He said, Dr. Kolst, can I ask you something? I said yes. He said, when the Karath guards lift the hammer in the ceremony, Do they do it because they did the math and the math said they could? Or do they do it because they're Karath? I didn't have an answer for that. Not a clinical one. He said, I've been reading about the ceremony. Vithrak told me about it. The weight of the hammer doesn't change, but the Karath who lift it don't think about the weight. They think about what they're doing it for. I said, that's not how physics works. He said, I know. I'm just curious whether physics is the only thing that matters here. I went back to my office and looked at my notes for a long time. I didn't sleep well that night. Witness 8 Vithrak, Junior Ceremonial Guard, Karath Dominion. Recorded 11 months post-incident. Location, Karath Dominion Territory, 3rd moon of Valdos Prime. Translated from High Karath, some nuance is estimated. The boy came to me on the 12th day. We had developed what I would call in Karath terms, we don't have a word for it quite, a kind of young creature bond. He asked questions, I answered them. He listened very carefully. He repeated things back to me in ways that showed he had understood them, not just heard them. This is unusual. Most beings ask questions and then wait for the answer to end so they can ask the next question. The boy genuinely absorbed what I told him. On the 12th day, he came to me and said, Vithrak, tell me how the Emperor lifts the Shathkral. I said he uses strength. The boy shook his head. He said, you told me before that the Emperor doesn't warm up before the lift. He doesn't adjust his stance. He doesn't use any technique. He just walks up and lifts it. How? It's not just muscle. I was quiet for a while. There is a concept in Karath. I'll try to explain it, though I'm not sure the translator does it justice, called Kralvith. It translates literally as the weight within weight. The idea is that an object as significant as the Shathkral has its own relationship with the being that lifts it. It is not a passive object. It has accumulated meaning over 1,400 years. When the Emperor approaches the Shathkral, he is not simply applying force to an object. He is entering into a relationship with everything the hammer has witnessed and carries. The Karath believe, and I believe this, I want to be clear, this is not a metaphor for me that the Shathkral recognizes worth. Not intelligence, not moral virtue, worthy weight. The weight of purpose. I explained this to the boy as best I could. He was very quiet while I spoke. When I finished, he said, so the hammer doesn't just test physical strength. I said, it tests the weight of what you carry with you. He said, what if someone carries something very heavy, even if they're small? I looked at him for a long time. He was standing very still. His face was not the face of someone who was going to do something foolish. It was the face of someone who had already decided and was simply ensuring they had understood everything correctly first. I said, young human, what do you carry? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my mother is on the Kreth border with 200,000 soldiers. If humanity gets flagged as a provisional member, if Valdros gets to define us as not ready, it affects the defensive arrangements, the resource allocations, the military support agreements. My mother's fleet would be classified under a different tier of compact protection. He paused. There are kids on those ships too, crew families, people who came along because there was nowhere else to go. And if the compact treats us as lesser, if Valdros gets to stand up in that hall and say we don't have enough weight, then it changes everything for them. I said nothing. I did not know what to say. He said, I'm not lifting it because I'm angry at Valdros. I'm lifting it because it matters. Does the hammer understand that? I had no answer that satisfied me. But I thought, if any non-Karath being could lift the Shathkral, it would be a being who asked that question. Part 3, the 14th day. Witness 1, Senior Trade Attaché Melvana Sor, continued. The presentation of witnesses ceremony was scheduled for the 14th day. It was the formal culmination of the summit, the moment where each delegation made their statement of intent regarding the compact, and where the Karath performed the Shathkral lift. The Hall of Records was at maximum capacity by the time the ceremony began. I estimated about 18,000 beings in that space. Representatives from every species in the summit, plus the media contingent, plus the station staff who had found reasons to be in the vicinity. The ceiling above us went up and up into the station's upper levels, and the sound in that space was this low, constant murmur that was 20 different species' ambient vocalization patterns blending together into something that felt almost like weather. The platform bearing the Shathkral was in the center of the hall. It had been lowered to floor level for the ceremony. The hammer sat on its cradle, a device designed to hold it at exactly the right angle for the lift, and even from the edges of the hall you could feel the weight of it. Not literally, of course, but there's a psychological reality to standing in the same room as 476 tons concentrated into a 3-meter shaft of stellar alloy. It changes the room. The proceedings began with the statements of intent. The hegemony's official representative spoke first, then the Vethori delegation, then the Drassic. Each statement was formal, carefully worded, and took about 20 minutes. I was tracking the time. Humanity's statement, delivered by Ambassador Assistant Halst, who was doing his best in difficult circumstances, was the 6th statement. He spoke for 18 minutes about human commitment to the principles of mutual defense and shared governance. He said nothing about the Compact's tiered membership structure, which was deliberate. He was buying time. During the statements, I was watching the human delegation. They were arranged in a group near the left side of the hall, Halst at the front. The other attachés and advisors ranged behind him. And Emmett was standing at the back of the group. He was wearing his blue observer badge. He had his notebook in one hand. I searched for the right word at the time, and I keep coming back to the same one. He looked calm. Not nervously calm, not performing calm. Genuinely, quietly calm. The way someone looks when they have decided something and are just waiting for the right moment. I noticed that his shoes were different. He'd changed into what looked like grip-soled footwear. Military style, the kind with the textured sole that maximizes surface contact on uneven terrain. The kind that someone might wear if they were going to try to push against something very heavy. I thought, oh no. And then I thought, oh. Witness 9, Jessa Malin, Human Diplomatic Corps Administrative Clerk. Recorded 4 months post-incident. Location, Human Embassy Station Administrative Block. I was standing right behind Emmett during the ceremony, like within touching distance. I want people to understand that for the first 13 days, Emmett had told nobody what he was planning. Not explicitly. Some people had suspicions, Dr. Kalst obviously, and I think Ambassador Halst had guessed, but nobody had confirmed it. And nobody had tried to stop him either, which I think says something about the situation we were in. Because here was the reality, we were getting crushed at this summit, diplomatically. The Compact's provisional membership language was almost certainly going to pass. Humanity was going to be classified as a junior species, not quite equal, not quite trusted, allowed in the room but not at the table. And that was going to have real consequences for the Kreth border situation, for the resource allocation agreements, for about 40 other things that Halst had been quietly panicking about for 2 weeks. Emmett hadn't told anyone what he was planning, but I think, by the 14th day, we all understood that something was going to happen. You don't run 12 kilometers a day and change your shoes for a formal ceremony without something being about to happen. When Emperor Valdros's delegation took the floor after humanity's statement, the energy in the room changed. The Karath's portion of the ceremony was the main event, everyone knew that. The room got quieter, focused, all those thousands of beings turning their attention to the center of the hall. Valdros spoke briefly. He didn't need to speak long. His presence did most of the speaking for him. He concluded his remarks with the statement of intent, the Karath Dominion's commitment to the Compact. And then he gestured to 2 of his guards, who stepped forward and removed the Shathkral from its ceremonial cradle, preparing it for the lift. The lift itself took about 40 seconds of preparation. The guards positioned the hammer on the floor at a specific angle. The audience went completely silent, and then Valdros stepped forward. He was magnificent, I'll say that even now. The way he moved toward the hammer it was like watching something that had been doing this for 200 years, which it had. He placed his lower hands on the shaft near the head, his upper hands at the midpoint, adjusted his stance slightly, and then he lifted. 476 tons came off the floor. The sound that went through the hall was this collective intake, like 18,000 beings breathing in at the same time. Because no matter how many times you read about it, seeing a being lift 500 tons is a different experience than knowing about it. Valdros held the lift for 47 seconds, longer than his previous record, we found out later. He set it down cleanly, took 1 step back, and stood with his arms slightly raised in the traditional post-lift posture. The applause, or the equivalent from 18 different species, was enormous. And then in the noise and the acclaim, I felt Emmett move. He was walking before I fully processed that he'd started walking, moving through the crowd toward the center of the hall. And I remember very clearly reaching out to say something, to stop him, to ask him, I don't know, and then not doing it. Because he was already through the front of the crowd, stepping into the open space around the platform, and people were noticing. Witness 5, Emmett Voss, continued. I'm going to try to tell this part carefully because I've gotten it wrong before in other tellings. I've made it sound more heroic than it was. I've made it sound like I was thinking clearly and executing a plan and feeling brave. I wasn't really, not fully. What I was feeling was something closer to nausea, not fear, not quite, more like the physical sensation of having decided to do something that cannot be undone. Like the moment you step off a platform toward water that might be cold enough to knock the breath out of you. You've decided. The decision is complete. Your body just hasn't caught up yet. I walked through the crowd. People moved. I don't think they moved intentionally. I think I was moving with enough certainty that beings made space without deciding to. That happens sometimes when someone moves like they know where they're going. The Karath guards saw me when I was about 10 meters from the hammer. They moved to intercept, not aggressively, but positioning themselves between me and the center. The one on the left was Vithrak. He looked at me with an expression that I still can't fully translate even now. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't surprise either. It was something that I later decided was recognition. I looked at Vithrak and I said quietly, "You know why I'm here." He was still for a moment. Then he stepped aside. I heard the murmur go through the hall. 18,000 beings processing the visual of a junior Karath ceremonial guard, stepping aside for a 16-year-old human in a blue observer badge. I kept walking. When I got to the hammer, I stopped. Up close, I'd been close to it before, I'd touched it before, but up close with the eyes of every being in the room on me, it was different. It was so large. The head of it was at about chest height on me. The shaft was wider than my shoulders. The material was dark and cold-looking and present in the way that only things with enormous mass are present. I heard someone in the crowd, I think it was from the Drassic contingent, say something that translated as, "What is the child doing?" And from the direction of the Karath delegation, I heard Emperor Valdros say, calmly, almost amusedly, "The child approaches the Shathkral." A pause. Let it approach. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't impressed, he was entertained. Like watching a small animal investigate, something far too large for it to interact with meaningfully. I placed my hands on the shaft of the hammer. The metal was cold, exactly as cold as it had been the first time I touched it on the 6th day, cold and dense and immovable. I thought about my mother. I thought about 200,000 people on ships at the edge of the Kreth border. I thought about Vithrak asking me, "What do you carry?" I thought about the answer I'd given him. I thought about whether it was true, whether it was enough, whether anything was enough. And then I stopped thinking entirely. Witness 6, Ambassador Assistant Farron Halst, continued. I've been asked to describe what I saw. I've been asked to describe it many times. I always find it difficult because the sequence of events is not what's important to me. What I saw that day is not difficult to describe. What I felt watching it is nearly impossible. But I'll try. Emmett stood at the hammer for about 30 seconds after placing his hands on it. The hall was very quiet, not the quiet of people waiting politely, the quiet of people who had stopped breathing. Emperor Valdros, from his position elevated on the ceremonial dais, was watching with an expression that I would describe as philosophical, as though this was an illustration of a point he had already made. Emmett adjusted his grip. He moved his right hand lower to the base of the shaft near the head. His left hand went to the midpoint. His feet were planted, those grip sole shoes, hip-width apart, slight bend at the knee. Correct deadlift stance, Dr. Kalst told me afterward. He breathed in. He pulled. Nothing happened for what felt like a very long time. Maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, the hammer did not move. Emmett's entire body went rigid with the effort. I could see it from where I stood, every muscle committed, every fiber, tendons in his neck standing out, jaw set. Not a sound from him, just the total, silent commitment of every physical resource he had. The hammer did not move. And then, it moved. Not much, not dramatically, not the way Valdros had lifted it, smoothly and with evident power. The head of the shathcrawl came off the floor by maybe 5 centimeters, maybe less. The kind of gap you'd have to look for to notice. But it came off the floor. I heard the sound that went through the hall. I don't have words for it. It was not applause. It was not a gasp. I've heard people describe it as the sound a room full of intelligent beings makes when their framework for understanding what is possible gets cracked. Like a very large, very carefully constructed piece of intellectual architecture developing its first fracture. Emmett held it for 6 seconds. 6 seconds where that 5-centimeter gap was maintained, where the shathcrawl was undeniably, physically, in violation of every calculation the Karath Science Division had made. 6 seconds, and then he set it down. Gently not dropping it, setting it, he controlled the descent. He stepped back. He was breathing hard. His hands were shaking. I could see that from where I stood, the fine tremor that comes from muscles that have been asked to do something at the absolute edge of their capacity. He turned around. He looked at Emperor Valdros. And Emperor Valdros, for the first time in 47 years of imperial rule, by his own later account, was silent. Witness 10, Chief Science Officer Drana Mel, Hegemony Scientific Division. Recorded 5 months post-incident. Location, Hegemony Science Division, Keldrath Station. I measured it. Afterward, when the ceremony had concluded and the hall was still in the particular chaos that follows something that nobody was prepared for, I went and I got my instruments and I measured. The indentation left in the floor plating by the shathcrawl's original position was unchanged. But there was an additional mark, adjacent to it, a shallow impression in the dense station, flooring from where the head of the hammer had been set back down at a slightly different angle. Which means it was definitely lifted and definitely repositioned. Not by much, but definitively lifted and repositioned. I ran the measurements 3 times. I submitted them to the Hegemony Science Division's peer review board. 11 scientists from 6 different species reviewed the measurements independently. The conclusion was unanimous. Emmett Voss, a 16-year-old human male massing approximately 62 kilograms, had lifted the head of the shathcrawl, mass confirmed at 476 metric tons, off the floor to a height of 4 to 6 centimeters, and held that lift for approximately 6 seconds. The physics of this are, there is no theoretical framework I am aware of that fully accounts for this. We have proposed models, neuromuscular intensity beyond mapped parameters, adrenaline response at extreme threshold, psychological state effects on neuromuscular recruitment, biomechanical efficiency in the specific grip stance adopted. None of these models fully close the gap. The Karath offered a different explanation. I am a scientist and I operate within scientific frameworks. But I will say, the Karath explanation is the only one that doesn't require an uncomfortable number of asterisks. They said the shathcrawl recognized the weight he carried. I cannot put that in a scientific paper, but I cannot fully dismiss it either. Science is honest about the things it cannot explain. What I can tell you is what I measured. What I can tell you is, it happened. Part 4, The Aftermath. Witness 1, Senior Trade Attaché Melvana Sor, continued. The hall remained in stunned silence for almost 3 minutes after Emmett stepped back. 3 minutes of 18,000 beings processing the same image. A human adolescent in a blue observer badge walking away from the shathcrawl. The first being to respond verbally was not from the human delegation. It was not from the hegemony. It was not from any of the established political blocs. It was from the Morn Collective's senior delegate, a being named Urath, who had been observing the summit in characteristic Morn silence for 2 weeks. The Morn are not a demonstrative species. They don't applaud. They don't cheer. Their version of profound acknowledgement is a very specific tonal sound that, when rendered in standard, comes out as something like the word witnessed. Urath made that sound, once into the silence, and then the rest of the hall began to respond. I will not romanticize it. It was not a unanimous ovation. The Karath delegation remained in the kind of collective stillness that I recognized from my 42 years of experience as a species processing something that had challenged a load-bearing assumption. There was no cheering from them, no acknowledgement, just stillness. But from everyone else, from the Vethori, from the Drassic, from the dozen smaller delegations, from the station staff at the edges of the hall, from the media contingent, there was a sound. A response. Each species' version of it was different, but they all meant the same thing. We saw it. Ambassador Assistant Halst had to be physically nudged by a colleague to remember that he should probably go stand near Emmett, who was standing somewhat alone in the center of the hall, breathing hard and shaking slightly and looking like a person who had just done something enormous and had not yet decided how to feel about it. Halst walked over to him. I was close enough to hear what he said. He said, "Emmett, are you all right?" And Emmett said, "Yeah, my hands hurt." Halst laughed. It was a slightly broken laugh, the kind that comes out when your body doesn't know how else to process what it just witnessed. He put a hand on Emmett's shoulder. He said, "Your mother is going to be furious at me." Emmett said, "Yeah. Probably." Witness 4, Imperial Protocol Officer Thessavaru, continued. I need to tell you what Emperor Valdros said, because there have been many versions of this in the record, and some of them are wrong. What he said, after the 3 minutes of silence, after the hall began to respond, after Emmett Voss stood in the center of the Hall of Records, surrounded by the noise of 18,000 beings who had just seen something they would spend the rest of their lives talking about. What Valdros said was not dramatic. It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that, because the records that portray it as an apology are inaccurate. It was not a concession, exactly. What he said was, and I am translating as precisely as I can from the High Karath original, the Shathkral does not lie. 4 words, 5 in standard. The Shathkral does not lie. In Karath jurisprudence, in Karath theology, in Karath cultural tradition, this phrase is a formal acknowledgement of demonstrated worth. It's the phrase used when the hammer has spoken and the result is accepted. It's not praise. It's not warmth. It's not Valdros saying, "You are my equal," or "I was wrong," or "humanity is magnificent." What it says is, the test was administered and the result was observed and the result is binding. For the Karath, that is everything. That is, in their framework, the highest acknowledgement available. Afterward, in the private session that followed the ceremony, the provisional membership language was removed from the compact. Unanimously, without a formal vote, because by then it was clear to every delegation in the room that a formal vote would not be necessary. Humanity was a foundation member of the Unification Compact. I asked Valdros later, privately, in a communication that was never intended for this record, I asked him if he had expected it. If any part of him had suspected what would happen when he gestured toward the Shathkral and issued his challenge on the 8th day. His response was, I expected the child to confirm what I already knew. Instead, the Shathkral informed me that what I knew was incomplete. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "This is how empires learn." Witness 8 Vithrak continued. I went to find the boy after the ceremony. It took me a while. The hall was in a particular kind of beautiful chaos, and the human delegation had surrounded him and were doing their version of celebration, which involved a lot of overlapping vocalization and physical contact that I found somewhat overwhelming, but clearly he found comforting. I waited. When the crowd around him thinned somewhat, I went to him. He saw me coming. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like he'd been waiting for me too. I said, "You asked me if the hammer understood what you carried." He said, "Yeah." I said, "I think I have an answer now." He waited. I said, "It did." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Vithrak, thank you for talking to me on the 4th day when you could have just told me to go away." I said, "I could not have told you to go away." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you asked me how the metal was formed, not what the hammer weighed, not whether you could lift it, how it was made." He thought about this. "A being who cares how things are made," I said, "cares about what things cost, about the work behind them. That is not a child's question." He looked at me with that cataloging expression I had come to recognize over the 14 days, taking everything in. Then he said, "I should write that down." He opened his notebook. Witness 3, Junior Communications Officer Talon Mace, continued. Okay, so in the interest of completeness, I should tell you about the call with Admiral Voss, because it's relevant and also, honestly, a little funny in retrospect. So the news reached the Kreth border about 6 hours after the ceremony. Military communication channels move fast when there's something significant. The human military attaché on Kael'drath had filed a report within 30 minutes of the incident, and that report went up the chain quickly. Admiral Petra Voss received the report while she was in the middle of a strategic briefing with her senior officers. By all accounts, and I have this from multiple sources, she read the report, set it face down on the briefing table, looked at her officers for a long moment, and then said, "We're going to take a 10-minute break." She went to her private office. She called Kael'drath Station. She got Ambassador Assistant Halst. She said, "Tell me what my son did." Halst told her. She was quiet for a while. She said, "Is he hurt?" Halst said, "His hands are bruised. Dr. Kalst says no structural damage." Another silence. Then Admiral Voss said, "I need to speak with him." Halst transferred the call. I wasn't in the room for the call, but Emmett told me about it afterward. He said his mother didn't say anything for about 30 seconds after the connection was established. Then she said, "Emmett." He said, "Hi, Mom." She said, "The Shathkral." He said, "Yeah." She said, "You were supposed to be an observer." He said, "I observed it first, very thoroughly." She said, 6 seconds. He said, "I know, I was hoping for more." And then, and this is the part I love, because it's so human, because it tells you everything, Admiral Petra Voss, commanding officer of 200,000 soldiers on a contested border, one of the most decorated military leaders of her generation, said, "Don't tell me it was because of me." Emmett said, "Why not?" She said, "Because then I'll cry in front of my fleet." He said, "I'll tell them you already knew." And she said, "I always knew. I just didn't know you did yet." Part 5, What It Meant. Witness 11, Professor Anna Say's Galactic History, University of New Tharsis. Recorded 4 years post-incident. Location, University of New Tharsis, Human Settlement, Kael'drath Station. I've spent 4 years studying the Kael'drath Summit in general and the Hammer incident specifically, and I want to offer an analytical perspective on why it mattered beyond the immediate political outcome. The provisional membership language was removed. That's the obvious political result. Humanity was designated a foundation member. The compact was signed. These things happened. They're documented. But I think the more significant effect was subtler and broader. The Karath have been a dominant military and cultural force in this arm for 2,000 years. 2,000 years of a philosophy that said, strength is measurable, strength is biological, strength can be assessed by instruments and predicted by parameters. The Shathkral was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. It was a test that for 1,400 years had produced consistent results. Known species could lift it, or they couldn't. The Hammer sorted the galaxy into 2 clear categories. Until Emmett Voss. The significance of what he did was not just that he lifted it. It was that he lifted it by the Karath's own standard, in the Karath's own ceremony, in front of the Karath's own emperor. He did not argue with the framework. He did not reject it or protest it or diplomatically maneuver around it. He accepted the test on its own terms and then exceeded what the test was designed to allow. That's not just a physical feat, that's a philosophical event. The Karath could not dismiss it. They could not attribute it to luck or measurement error. Chief Science Officer Mel's report is thorough and unambiguous. They could not reinterpret it as something other than what it was. The Shathkral was their standard. Emmett met their standard. By the Karath's own logic, they had to accept the result. What followed over the years after the summit was a slow but genuine shift in how the Karath engaged with species they had previously classified as lesser. Not a revolution. Not an overnight transformation of a 2,000-year culture, but a shift, a crack in the framework through which something different could grow. I've interviewed Karath scholars who describe the Hammer incident as the beginning of what they call the reassessment, a period in Karath philosophical development when they began to reconsider what weight actually means, what it measures, whether the Shathkral had always been measuring what they thought it was measuring, whether it might have been measuring something they had not thought to quantify. That philosophical work is ongoing. I think it will take generations to complete. But it started on the 14th day of the Kael'drath Summit, when a 16-year-old boy in a blue observer badge walked to the center of a hall full of the galaxy's great powers and put his hands on something that should have been impossible. Witness 17, name withheld, species withheld. Recorded 2 years post-incident, translated from olfactory language. Note some nuance is estimated. I was in the back of the hall, very far from the center. I am a small species and we were not a major delegation. We were there as observers like the boy, though without the badge. From where I stood, I could not see the specific gap between the hammer's head and the floor. I could not verify the lift visually. But I can tell you what I experienced. There is a phenomenon in my species' sensory understanding that we call the thread in air, the thing that carries intention from one being to others in a shared space, a kind of emotional transmission that moves through a room the way a current moves through water. My species is sensitive to it in ways that others are not. When the hammer moved, when that boy lifted it, even those 5 centimeters, even those 6 seconds, I felt the thread in air change. Not for everyone, not immediately, but it rippled, from the center out. The thread in air in that hall, which for 13 days had carried a particular weight, the weight of established power, of assumed hierarchy, of 12 species worth of certainty about the order of things, it cracked. The thread frayed. Something new entered it. In my language, we have a word for this. It translates approximately as the moment when a small thing carries more weight than a large thing and the large thing knows it. That word applies to many situations, to moments in nature when a small creature does something that forces a large creature to stop, to moments in history when a quiet action overturns a loud established truth. It applies to what happened in the Hall of Records on the 14th day. The boy was small, the hammer was enormous, the emperor had ruled for 200 years. And the thread in air said, the small thing is heavier. Witness 5, Emmett Voss, continued. They asked me to speak at a ceremony 2 years after it happened, the first anniversary of the compact signing. It was a big event, lots of delegations, lots of important beings. They wanted me to say something meaningful. I wrote about 40 different versions of what I was going to say. Most of them were terrible, too polished, too neat, too much like the version of events that gets put into official records. Eventually, I threw them all away and just said what I actually thought. I said something like, look, I'm going to tell you what was actually going through my head when I was standing at the hammer, not the inspiring version, the real version. I was thinking about my mom. I was thinking about the kids on her fleet. I was thinking about Vithrak stepping aside for me and why he did it. I was thinking about the cold feeling of the metal under my hands. I was thinking that I had completely underestimated how heavy 476 tons actually is, even when you know the number intellectually, even when you've done the math. The math does not prepare you for the physical reality. I was thinking that I might have made a significant miscalculation, and that the most embarrassing possible outcome was about to happen in front of every important being in 600 inhabited systems. And then I thought, okay, even if this is a miscalculation, even if the outcome is embarrassing, even if I strain every muscle in my body and this thing doesn't move 1 millimeter, what is the alternative? What was I going to do? Walk away? Go back to my spot at the back of the delegation and watch humanity get classified as a lesser species for the next generation. I'm 16, I don't have a lot of options. I have hands and I have reason and I have things I care about. Those are the materials I had to work with. So I used them. That's all it was. I want people to know that. It was not superhuman confidence. It was not a grand strategic calculation. It was a 16-year-old looking at a terrible situation and asking, what do I have and what can I do with it? The hammer moved. I still don't fully understand why it moved. Dr. Kalst and her team don't fully understand why it moved. The Kareth have a belief about why it moved that I find, honestly, more satisfying than the scientific explanations, even though I'm not sure I can call it a belief exactly. What Vithrak told me about the weight within weight, about the hammer recognizing what you carry. I don't know if I believe in that in a literal sense, but I believe in what it's pointing at. I believe that the things we care about genuinely, deeply care about, they're not nothing. They're not separate from what we're capable of doing. They're part of it. My mother is at the edge of the border with 200,000 people. That's weight, real weight, not metaphorical weight. The weight of real lives in real danger, the weight of consequences that would ripple from this hall if the wrong outcome happened. I carried that weight to the hammer. Whether it helped or not, I can't tell you. The science can't tell you. The Karath have their version. What I can tell you is, the hammer moved, and the people who mattered to me were safer afterward. That's enough for me. Epilogue from the Chief Archivist. We have come to the end of the compiled testimony. There are things we do not know. We do not know with scientific certainty why the lift was possible. We do not know whether a different human, on a different day, with different things at stake, could replicate it. We do not know whether the Shathkral's 1400-year record of consistent results was always limited, always missing something, always measuring a thing smaller than what it thought it was measuring. These questions remain open. What we know is what 37 witnesses told us, from 7 species, across 11 years of carefully collected testimony. We know that on the 14th day of the Kael'drath Summit, a 16-year-old human named Emmett Voss walked to the center of the Hall of Records and placed his hands on the Shathkral. We know that the Shathkral moved. We know that Emperor Valdros said, "The Shathkral does not lie." We know that the provisional membership language was removed from the compact. We know that humanity has been a foundation member of the Unification Compact for 3 years now, with full voting rights, full resource access, and full defensive parity. We know that Admiral Petra Voss's fleet was reinforced within 2 months of the summit, under the new compact's military alignment provisions, and that the Kreth border situation was resolved without conflict 6 months after that. We know that Emmett Voss, when asked by a young hegemony school delegate what it felt like to lift the Shathkral, said, "Cold, it felt cold, and then it felt like the most important thing I'd ever done, and then my hands hurt for about 2 weeks. We know that Vithrak, the junior Karath ceremonial guard who stepped aside, was asked by his superior officer why he had done so. He said, "Because the boy asked how the metal was formed, not if he could lift it. How it was made." His superior officer said, "What does that have to do with anything?" Vithrak said, "Everything." We know that somewhere in the official archive of the Karath Dominion, the Kael'drath Summit record now contains a notation beside the presentation of witnesses' ceremony. The notation is in High Karath. It reads,